So there are two topics in this space physics. One is about the Earth and the solar system. And the second topic is about the formation of the stars, how stars can form. So Earth and the solar system is the first topic. And in the subtopic is about the day and night. So what is the reason? What is the cause? Why the day changes to night or night changes to day? That is mainly due to the rotation of the earth in its own axis. So earth is, and what is, when we divide the earth, the vertical line, that is an axis of the earth. But this axis of the earth, this is a vertical line, imaginary line, which we consider passing through, that is known as the axis. And the horizontal line, the imaginary line, which divide the earth into two parts, that is called equator. And this, when we divide the earth into two parts, these parts are known as hemispheres. So the top part is known as the northern hemisphere, and the bottom part is known as the southern hemisphere. So equator is a horizontal line. It's again the imaginary line. Reality, it's not there. Imaginary line which is passing through the center, divide the earth into two parts. That is called equator. And equator divide the earth into hemisphere. The top part is known as the northern hemisphere, and the bottom part is known as the southern hemisphere. And the axis of the earth is not exactly vertical. The axis of the earth is slightly tilted or bent about 23.5 degrees from vertical. Like if we take a vertical line, so if we take a vertical line, how the earth is moving or spinning around its own axis, a slight tilt of 23.5. So as the earth spin in its own axis, the parts which experience the sunlight, that parts will experience the day, and the parts when the sunlight does not reach, that will experience the night. So as you can see, like this is how the earth axis is slightly tilted. Like this is a vertical line, and you can see that this axis of the earth is tilted. So this is a vertical line, and this one is the axis of the earth. So it is slightly tilted with an angle of 23.5 degrees. And due to this tilt, the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere will not experience the same amount of or receive the same amount of light or energy. In this case, which hemisphere will receive more energy, southern hemisphere or the northern hemisphere? Where at this position, which hemisphere is receiving greater amount of energy or light from the sun?
Southern hemisphere.
So the southern hemisphere is experiencing, like receiving more energy than the northern hemisphere. So as a result, what will happen? As more energy, so there will be summer in the southern hemisphere and there will be winter in the northern hemisphere. So due to the tilt of axis of the earth, the two parts, the hemisphere, will not receive the same amount of energy, and the part which experience more energy, there will be summer, and the part which receives less energy, there will be winter. But after 6 months, this will be the new position. Now you can see, like if say it was on the left, now it is relatively on the right, or it moves after 6 months. So it is actually on, because earth is taking 12 months to completely revolve around the sun. So after 6 months, it will be on the opposite side. In this case, the top side, which is a northern hemisphere, and the bottom is a southern hemisphere. So which hemisphere is receiving more energy or more light?
The northern hemisphere.
So the northern hemisphere receiving more energy than the southern hemisphere. As a result, there will be summer in the northern hemisphere and there will be winter in the southern hemisphere. So the seasons are due to the tilt in the axis of the earth. And how much is this angle? What is this tilt angle from the vertical? So it is
35.
23.5. You have to learn this value that it is 23.5 degrees. So as you can see here, this is the image I cropped from the book. So different positions are there. So as you can see from this one, this is the axis of rotation, axis around which the earth is spinning. And we divide this into two parts. What we call this line, the central line, imaginary line.
Equator.
Equator. So we call this equator. And when we equate the top, it divided into two parts. The top part is known as the northern hemisphere, and the bottom part is the southern hemisphere. So which hemisphere is receiving more energy from the sun at this position?
The southern hemisphere.
So the southern hemisphere is receiving more energy. As a result, there will be summer in the southern hemisphere and the winter experience in the northern hemisphere, because the northern hemisphere amount of energy which it receive from the sun is less as compared to southern hemisphere. So there will always be opposite seasons. Like if there is a summer in the southern hemisphere, there will be winter in the northern hemisphere. Or if there's a winter in the southern hemisphere, then there will be summer in the. Yes, Mohammed Ashraf.
Sir, is the seasons are depending on the orbit, like the far point from the sun in the orbit will cause like.
Season depends on both orbit and the hemisphere which is facing the, like, which is receiving more energy and which receive less energy. So orbit of the earth as well as the position of the, like, axis or the tilt in the axis of earth, both are responsible for the seasons. Because for example, if the earth axis was not tilted, like this is our earth and it was the axis of around which the earth is spinning, that was exactly vertical. So in that case, the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere will receive the same amount of energy. So in that case, we'll have the same season, like same temperature, same weather conditions in the southern and the northern hemisphere. But due to this tilt, the southern hemisphere received different amount of energy than the northern hemisphere. That is why we'll have a season. So position of the earth as well as the axis of like the orientation, the tilt in the axis is responsible for the season. So what you will discuss here in space physics, you will consider the tilt in the axis is responsible for the seasons. Clear?
Yes, sir, clear.
Now, what will happen? What will happen after a 6 months, or here the 3-month duration is given. So first we have in December in the southern hemisphere example, we have summer, and the northern hemisphere we have winter. Now what happened as after 3 months, it will cover 1/4 of its orbit, like in March. Now in March, because initially the southern hemisphere was receiving more energy, but when it changes its position, so amount of energy received by the southern hemisphere will start to decrease, and the amount of energy received by the northern hemisphere will start to increase. That is why after summer we will have a fall, autumn will be there, because in summer the plants receiving more energy, they undergo greater rate of photosynthesis, But as the orientation, the position is changing, the amount of energy received by the southern hemisphere, that decreases. So if the amount of energy decreases, it means the plants cannot undergo the same rate of photosynthesis. So the plants, the leaves start to fall, and what we call the season, we call that as autumn. But the opposite will happen because the northern hemisphere was receiving less energy. Like this is the minimum energy they were receiving. And in summer, they receive the maximum energy. So in the northern hemisphere, because it was winter in December, and now what happened after 3 months, the amount of energy which they receive, that start to increase. So the plants undergo greater rate of photosynthesis. And as the rate of photosynthesis increase, like new plants start to grow, the flower starts to grow. And what season we will have? We will have a spring. Then what happened after a 6 month, the position of the earth will exactly opposite. So as a position of the earth is exactly opposite now, uh, which hemisphere is receiving more energy, northern or the southern, in June?
North there.
So the northern hemisphere is receiving the greater amount of energy as compared to southern hemisphere. So means the northern hemisphere will receive maximum energy and the southern hemisphere will receive minimum energy, because greater part is facing like more, it's receiving, or greater part is facing the sun. So as a result, what will happen? As it receives the maximum amount of energy, the spring season changes to summer. And so here also it is increasing. The increase here refers to amount of light or amount of solar energy. Then further, from autumn, when it turned into winter, the further the amount of energy or the light which is received, that is decreasing. So as a result, what will happen? We'll have a winter season. So in a winter season, we'll have a minimum solar energy in southern hemisphere, and in northern hemisphere, we'll have a maximum solar energy. And again, what happened after another 3 months when it changes orientation, position? So the amount of energy received by the southern hemisphere start to increase. So when winter, after winter, like the more energy it's received, so the plants again start to grow. So what season we'll have? We'll have a spring season. But for the northern hemisphere, what will happen? The amount of energy which receives start to decrease. So we'll have a fall or autumn. So as the position of the earth changes, the amount of energy received by the northern and the southern hemisphere changes. If northern hemisphere receive the maximum energy, it will have summer in northern. And if the southern hemisphere receive the minimum energy, it will be winter. So there will be opposite seasons. If or the northern hemisphere we have summer, in the southern hemisphere we'll have winter, or other way around. So these are the keywords, key definitions which you have to memorize. First one is the axis. What is an axis? It's an imaginary line between the Earth, North and the South Pole. When we join the Earth, North and South Pole, we call that line as an axis. What is an orbit? The path of an object as it moves around on a larger object, that is called an orbit. Like this one, this whole path is refers to orbit of the Earth. And the line, imaginary line which join the North Pole with the South Pole, what we call that as axis. Then what are hemispheres? Hemispheres, basically half of a sphere. So the Earth can be considered to made up of two hemispheres. which is divided by equator. And equator is again, it's an imaginary line halfway between the North Pole and the South Pole. The next topic is about the phases of the moon. Like what caused the moon to change its phase. So what happened to the moon? The moon is revolving around the earth. As the moon is revolving around the earth, the amount of example on, say, on our right hand side, if there is a sun. So it totally depends on the position of the moon. For example, the moon is at position 1. I will name this, for example, this is position 1. So as a result, what will happen? The light strike and moon does not give out its own light. It reflects the light of the So as a result, because this part will reflect the light from the sun, so we won't be able to see the moon, because what we see the reflection of the light from the, like moon is not giving out its own light, it is reflecting the light from the sun. So at this position, we have a sun, light from the sun, strike the moon and bounce back. So we don't receive any light from the moon or reflected light from the moon. As a result, we don't see the moon. And what we call that, when we don't see the moon, we say that is a new moon. Like the moon will not appear on the sky. It is there, but it's not visible because it is not reflecting the light from the sun. But when it changes a position, another day, and the cycle of this moon, it's about 28 days. It takes about 28 days to move. Like when it is at this position, it takes 28 days to return back to the same position. So when it changes, like it moves, say this is the second position. Now at this position, the moon reflect the light, but it's not reflecting all of the light. Some part of the light is reflected. So what we'll observe a crescent. Waxing crescent is when the size of the moon is increasing, there is a reflection of the light, but that reflection, we don't receive it because the part of the moon which is facing the sun, it like the first one, the light from the moon, light from the sun, strike the moon and bounce back. So we don't receive that because it is exactly the face which we see is not reflecting any light. But here what will happen? The light strike and we receive that. So we receive some light. That's why we observe not the full moon or not the half moon, only a part of a moon, which is known as the crescent. So the part of the light which is reflected, we observe, and as a result, what will happen? We'll observe a crescent. When the size of the moon, because you will observe like for first 14 days, the size increases, and then the next 14 days, the size decreases. So when the size is increasing, we call that as a waxing. And when the size decreases, we call waning. So first we'll have a waxing crescent, not half moon, like less than half moon, that's a waxing crescent. Then what will happen? Like this is the position of the moon. So greater amount of light is reflected. As greater amount of light is reflected, we are able to observe half of the moon, and what we call that as a first quarter, or we call a half moon. Then this position, when the moon is at this position, like about 3/4 of the moon is visible. So as a result, what will happen? Greater amount of a light is reflected to earth. We call that as a gibbous moon or a waxing gibbous, you can say. Waxing is a term we use, like it's spreading or increasing in size. and waning is when it start to decrease in size. So when we have a full moon, like maximum amount of the light is reflected. So as a result, maximum amount of the light is reflected from the moon. What we'll observe? We'll observe a full moon. So this position will observe full moon. And then again, it changes the position. Now the size, like the amount of a light which is reflected from the moon surface start to decrease as it's changing the position. So we'll have a waning gibbous. Gibbous is like example 3/4, what we see, that is a gibbous. And waning because it's decreasing in size. Waxing when it is increasing in size. Like in this one, say this is an example. Say this bulb is representing a sun and this is the moon. And consider yourself as the earth, like you are looking at from the earth. So this is what the full moon appear. Actually, this whole part will be blocked. So when it will block the light from the sun, like backside is reflecting, you can see here, like we are observing the light from the sun strike the moon and bounce off. We don't see the light. So as a result, what we'll not see anything. And as a result, what we say it's a new moon. Now, as it changed the position, so as we change or we move, so you can see this is a crescent and it's a waxing crescent because the size start to increase. So this is a sun, small part of a light reflected and we receive. So as a result, what we observe a waxing crescent. Then further, as the moon is continuously moving around the earth, it's changing the position. So this is a waxing crescent, or we can also say a crescent moon. Now, as it starts to move further, you can see greater part of a moon is visible. So we call that as a gibbous, or first quarter, you can say. And then we have a gibbous, like example, more than half is visible. That's gibbous. And then at this position, what we have a full moon. Like one side we have the sun, other side we have the moon, and we are observing from here. Then again, further we move. So it start to change the orientation, and then it will be the waning gibbous, then half moon will be there. That's a last quarter or a half moon. And then we have a waning crescent, like it start to disappear. And again, it will be at the same position. So we'll have a new moon. So this is how the phases of the moon changes. It totally depends on the position of the moon. So first, when the moon is exactly blocking all the light from the sun, and when it is exactly all are in line, then we have an eclipse, the lunar eclipse. But when part is visible, then like this, you can see it's a crescent. Then as it moves, the first quarter or a half moon is there, which is because this part will be visible, which is reflecting the light. This part will be visible and this we don't see. So that's why that's a half crescent or a half moon. No, not half crescent, half moon. Then it's a gibbous. Like you can see still, like this part will be visible, which is reflecting the light, and this we won't be able to see. As it further rotates, then we have a full moon. As you can see here, this we have a full moon, like all the light is reflected. Then this amount of a light which is reflected from the moon start to decrease. So we have a waning gibbous, like here, like this part will be visible. this part won't be visible. So this is not a full moon. Then we have a last quarter as the half of the moon at this point. At this point, this part will be visible and this is not visible. That's a last quarter. And then we have crescent again. That is a waning crescent. So this part is visible. And the remaining part is not visible. It's not reflecting the light. This room is not completely dark. That's why this part still we can see. But for the case of moon, this part won't be visible. And then again, it returned back. So we have a new moon. So this is how the phases of the moon changing. When it is increasing in the size, we call that as a waxing. When decreasing in size, waning. And when we start like new moon, crescent, first quarter, gibbous, and then again other way around. So you should be able to label the positions of like when we have a waxing and a waning crescent, as well as the so moon is actually, as it is moving around the earth, the cycle, like the moon orbits about the earth in 27.5 days, or 28 you can also say, because the variation is there. And the relative position to the earth changes and it appears different as the amount of a light from a sun is reflected. And this cause of the change is known as the phases of the moon. Like as the moon is moving, amount of a light reflected from the moon changes, and that we call that as a phases of the moon. So definition of the phase of the moon is the different ways the moon looks when we view from the earth over a period of 1 month. That is refers to phase of the moon.